Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. The self that is presented to others is not the self that exists in private, is not the unfiltered consciousness that experiences doubt and desire, and the raw sensations that never make it into words. And this gap between inner and outer, between what is felt and what is performed, is not deception in the usual sense, is not dishonesty or manipulation, though it can become those things, is rather the fundamental structure of social existence, the way that human beings must translate the chaos of subjective experience into forms that others can recognize, can respond to, can incorporate into their own understanding. And this translation is always a performance, always a presentation of self that is shaped by audience, by context, by the roles that are available, by the scripts that culture provides. And the person performing is usually unaware of performing, usually believes that the presented self is the real self, that the role is identity, that the mask is the face, and this belief is necessary, is what makes the performance convincing, because a performance that is known to be performance breaks the illusion, creates distance, makes interaction awkward. And so the actor must forget they are acting, must inhabit the role so completely that it feels natural, feels spontaneous, feels like authenticity. Even though authenticity is itself a performance, is itself a role that can be played well or badly. And the irony is that the pursuit of authenticity, the desire to be real, to be genuine, to present the true self, often produces the most theatrical performances, the most carefully curated presentations, because authenticity has become a value, has become something to be achieved. And achievement requires effort, requires strategy, requires the very calculation that authenticity is supposed to transcend. And so people perform authenticity, perform vulnerability, perform the disclosure of inner experience in ways that are designed to elicit specific responses, to create specific impressions. And the performance is so smooth, so practiced, that it does not feel like performance, feels instead like courage, like honesty, like the removal of masks, when really it is just a different mask, just a different role, the role of the authentic person. And this role has its own rules, its own expectations, its own ways of being performed correctly. And those who perform it well are rewarded with trust, with intimacy, with the sense that they are real in a way that others are not. But the reality is constructed, is as much a presentation as any other, is distinguished only by the fact that it is currently valued, currently believed to be the marker of genuine selfhood. And in another time, another culture, a different performance would be valued, a different role would signify authenticity, and the self would adapt, would learn the new script, would perform the new role with the same conviction, the same sense of being true to something essential. And this adaptability reveals that there is no essential self, no core identity that exists independent of performance, only the capacity to perform, the ability to take on roles, to switch between them, to present different faces to different audiences. And this switching is not pathological, is not evidence of fragmentation or disorder, is simply the normal operation of social cognition, the way that human beings navigate the complex demands of living among others, who have expectations, who assign meaning to behaviour, who respond not to inner states but to outer presentations. And the outer must be managed, must be controlled, must be performed in ways that produce the desired effects. And the desired effects vary by situation, by relationship, by goal. And so the self that is presented varies as well, is different at work than at home, different with friends than with strangers, different in public than in private. And each version feels real in the moment, feels like the self, but the multiplicity suggests that the self is not a thing but a process, not an entity but an activity. The activity of presenting, of performing, of managing the impression that others form. And this management is constant, is exhausting, is the hidden labour that underlies all social interaction. The work of monitoring how one is being received, adjusting tone and posture and expression to match the demands of the situation, suppressing impulses that would be inappropriate, amplifying qualities that are valued. And this work is largely unconscious, is automatic, is the result of years of training in how to be a person, how to perform the role that culture assigns. And the training begins in childhood, begins with the learning of language, of gesture, of the countless small behaviours that signal, membership that indicate understanding of the rules, and children who fail to learn these behaviours, who cannot perform the expected roles, are marked as strange, as other, as outside the social order, and the marking is punishment, is exclusion, is the withdrawal of recognition, and recognition is what makes selfhood possible, is the confirmation that the performance is successful, that the presented identity is accepted, is real, and without recognition the self becomes unstable, becomes uncertain, becomes desperate for validation, for proof that it exists. And this desperation drives performance, drives the endless adjustment and refinement of presentation, drives the pursuit of authenticity that is really the pursuit of recognition, the desire to be seen, to be known, to be confirmed in one's existence by the gaze of another. And the gaze is selective, is interpretive, sees not what is actually there but what it expects to see, what it has been trained to see by culture, by category, by stereotype. And the person being gazed upon knows this, adjusts accordingly, performs the role that the gaze expects or deliberately subverts it, performs the opposite, performs resistance, but resistance is also performance, is also a role, the role of the rebel, the nonconformist, the authentic individual who refuses to play the game. And this refusal is its own game, its own set of rules, its own performance that must be maintained. And the maintenance is exhausting, is perhaps more exhausting than conformity, because it requires constant vigilance, constant assertion of difference, constant performance of not performing. And the paradox is that the more one tries to escape performance, the more theatrical the presentation becomes, the more calculated the spontaneity, the more rehearsed the authenticity. And there is no escape from this paradox, no way to be social without performing, because sociality is performance, is the presentation of self to others in forms that can be recognized, and recognition requires forms, requires categories, requires roles that are shared, that are understood, that carry meaning beyond the individual. And the individual is always exceeding these categories, is always more complex than any role can contain, is always feeling things that cannot be expressed, thinking things that cannot be said, experiencing a richness of inner life that the performance necessarily simplifies, necessarily reduces. And this reduction is the cost of being understood, the price of social existence. And the question is whether the price is worth paying, whether the recognition gained is worth the self that is lost. And the answer varies, is different for different people at different times, and some find the performance liberating, find relief in the structure, in the clarity of roles, in the ability to step into a character and leave the chaos of unmediated experience behind. And others find it suffocating, find the roles too constraining, the masks too heavy, the gap between inner and outer too painful. And these are the ones who talk about authenticity, who long for genuine connection, who want to be seen as they really are, but what they really are is not something that can be seen, is not something that can be presented, is only something that can be lived. And lived experience is private, is immediate, is lost in the translation to performance. And so the longing for authenticity is a longing for the impossible, for a form of recognition that would not require form, for a connection that would not require mediation, for a self that could be known without being performed. And this self does not exist, has never existed, is a fiction, is the romantic myth of the true self that lurks beneath the social surface, waiting to be discovered, to be liberated, to be expressed. But there is no beneath. There is no depth where the true self resides. There is only surface, only performance, only the endless presentation of forms that are more or less successful, more or less satisfying, more or less exhausting. And the exhaustion is real, is the inevitable result of constant performance, of the effort required to maintain coherence, to present a self that is consistent across contexts, that makes sense as a character, that can be narrated as a story. And the story is always being edited, always being revised, always adjusting to new information, to new audiences, to new demands. And the editing is not optional, is not something that can be refused without cost, because the cost is unintelligibility, is the failure to make sense, is the breakdown of social recognition. And without recognition, the self dissolves, becomes nothing, becomes the raw experiencing that has no form, no identity, no place in the social world. And the social world is the only world there is the only context in which selfhood is possible. And so the performance continues, must continue, is the condition of being human, of being a creature that exists not alone but among others, not in isolation but in relationship. And relationship requires presentation, requires the management of impressions, requires what Irving Goffman called dramaturgy, the theatrical metaphor for social life, the idea that all interaction is performance, that every encounter has a front stage where the performance happens and a backstage where the actor prepares. And the backstage is not more real than the front stage, is not where the true self resides, is simply where a different performance happens. The performance of relaxation, of letting down the guard, of being off duty. But this too is performed, is presented to those who are allowed backstage, who are granted access to the private self. And the private self is itself public in a different way, is itself a presentation designed for a specific audience, the audience of intimates, of those who are supposed to see the unguarded version. And the unguarded version is still guarded, is still shaped by expectations, by the desire to be seen in a particular way, by the need to maintain certain impressions, even in intimacy, especially in intimacy, because intimacy is where the stakes are highest, where the performance matters most, where failure to maintain character can destroy relationships, can shatter the trust that depends on consistency, on the beloved being who they claim to be, on the friend being recognizable, on the self being stable enough to be relied upon. And stability requires performance, requires the suppression of variability, the editing out of contradictions, the maintenance of a coherent narrative that makes the self intelligible as a character. And characters are not people, are simplifications, are abstractions, are the reduction of complexity to manageable form. And the management is necessary, is what makes interaction possible, but it comes at a cost, the cost of everything that does not fit the character, everything that contradicts the narrative, everything that would make the self less coherent, less consistent, less recognizable. And what does not fit is suppressed, is hidden, is relegated to the back regions of consciousness where it cannot disrupt the performance. And sometimes the suppression is so successful that the performer forgets what has been suppressed, loses access to the parts of experience that do not fit the role. And this forgetting is adaptive, is functional, is what allows the performance to be convincing, to be believed by others and by the self. But it creates a split, creates the sense that something is missing, that the performed self is incomplete, is not capturing everything. And this sense drives the search for authenticity, drives the belief that there is a true self waiting to be discovered, waiting to be expressed. But what is found when the search is pursued is not a true self, but more performances, more roles, more ways of presenting that feel more or less authentic depending on how well they are received, on how much recognition they generate, on how satisfying the performance is to the performer. And satisfaction is not a property of the role itself, but of the response it elicits, of the confirmation it receives, of the way it makes the social world respond. And the response is what matters, is what makes performance meaningful, is what converts the theatrical into the real. Because the real is not opposed to performance, but is produced by performance, is the effect of successful presentation, is what happens when the audience believes, when the role is inhabited so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from identity. And identity is not what the person is, but what the person is taken to be, what they are recognized as, what social position they occupy. And the occupation of position requires performance, requires the enactment of the behaviors associated with the position, and the behaviors must be performed correctly, or the position is lost. The identity is challenged, the self is thrown into crisis, and crisis is the breakdown of performance, is the moment when the role no longer works, when the script fails, when the audience refuses to play along. And these moments are revealing, are glimpses of the machinery behind the presentation, are proof that the self is constructed rather than discovered, is maintained rather than simply existing. And the maintenance is work, is constant work, is the hidden labour that everyone performs, but no one acknowledges, because acknowledging it would break the illusion, would make it impossible to believe in the roles. And belief is necessary, is what makes the performance effective, what makes social life possible. And so the work is hidden, is naturalized, is treated as if it were not work at all, but simply being oneself. And being oneself is the most demanding performance of all, is the role that requires the greatest consistency, the most careful management, the most exhaustive monitoring, because the self is the character that must be maintained across all contexts. That must make sense as a continuous identity, despite the fact that it is constantly shifting, constantly adapting, constantly being performed differently for different audiences. And the audiences do not see the shifts, do not notice the code switching, the way the person becomes different when they move from one social context to another, the way they adjust accent and vocabulary and posture and attitude to match the expectations of each situation. And this adjustment is automatic, is unconscious, is learned so thoroughly that it feels natural. But it is performance, is the work of fitting in, of being appropriate, of presenting a self that will be accepted, and acceptance is survival, is the condition of social existence. And those who cannot perform, who cannot adjust, who cannot present themselves in forms that others recognize and value, are excluded, are marginalized, are marked as failures, as problems, as people who cannot be understood. And understanding is recognition, is the confirmation that the performance has been received, has been interpreted correctly, has produced the intended effect. And the intended effect is always social, is always about positioning the self in relation to others, about claiming status, about asserting value, about demonstrating competence or vulnerability or power or need, depending on what the situation demands. And the demands are relentless, are changing, are requiring constant recalibration, constant adjustment of the performance to match new circumstances, new audiences, new expectations. And the exhaustion of this is cumulative, is building over time, is the reason why people speak of being tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of maintaining the masks, and the desire to drop the masks is the desire to stop working, to stop performing, to simply be without the labor of presentation. But being without presentation is not possible, is not a coherent idea, because being is always for someone, is always in relation, is always already a presentation. Even when it feels like pure existence, and the feeling of pure existence is itself a performance, is the role of the authentic person who has transcended roles. And this transcendence is another role, is perhaps the most demanding role, because it must be performed without seeming to be performed, must appear effortless while requiring tremendous effort, must seem natural while being highly artificial, and the artifice is what makes it work, is what makes authenticity convincing, is what allows the performance to succeed. And success is measured not by internal states, but by external validation, by the response of others, by whether the performance is believed, and belief is what converts performance into reality, is what makes the presented self into the real self, is what allows people to say, "This is who I am," and mean it, even though who they are is what they're performing, is what they have learned to present, is what has been confirmed through recognition. And the confirmation is never final, is always provisional, is always requiring renewal, requiring continued performance, requiring the maintenance of character across time. And time reveals the instability of identity, reveals that the self is not fixed but fluid, not stable but shifting, not essential but contingent, contingent on circumstances, on audiences, on the roles that are available, on the scripts that can be enacted. And when the scripts fail, when the roles become unavailable, when the audience changes, the self changes with it, becomes someone else, performs a different character. And this transformation can be smooth or traumatic depending on how much is invested in the previous identity, on how deeply the role has been internalized, on whether the person believes they are the role or knows they are performing it. And knowing does not make the performance less real, but it does make it less rigid, makes it possible to change without crisis, to adopt new roles without losing the sense of continuity. And continuity is the narrative thread that connects performances, that makes the self coherent across transformations, that allows someone to say, "I have changed, but I am still me." And the still me is the story, is the interpretation that makes the changes make sense, that integrates them into a single life, a single identity. And the integration is retrospective, is always looking back and reinterpreting the past in light of the present, making the past make sense as preparation for who one is now. And who one is now is who one is performing now, is the current role, the current presentation. And this will change, will be different in a year, in a decade, will be looked back upon as another version, another performance in the long series of performances that constitute a life. And the life is not the sum of these performances, but the narrative that connects them, the story that makes them cohere. And the story is itself a performance, is the presentation of a life as meaningful, as directed, as having purpose and continuity, when really it is just one thing after another, just a series of moments that are connected by memory and interpretation, not by any underlying essence, not by any true self that persists through change. And the absence of essence is not a problem, is not a lack, is simply the human condition, is what it means to be a creature that exists socially, that depends on recognition, that has no identity outside of performance, outside of the presentations that are received and confirmed and converted into reality through the collective agreement that this performance counts, that this role is real, that this person is who they claim to be. And the claim is always a performance, is always a presentation that could be otherwise, that could be challenged, that could be refused, and the refusal would unmake the identity, would leave the person without form, without recognition, without a place in the social order. And this is the terror that keeps performance going, that makes authenticity impossible and necessary at the same time, that ensures the exhaustion will continue, the masks will be maintained, the roles will be performed, because the alternative is not freedom, but dissolution. Not authenticity, but unintelligibility. Not the true self, but no self at all. And no self is what humans cannot tolerate, cannot survive, cannot be. And so they perform, must perform, will always perform. And the performance is not false, but is what makes truth possible, is what makes identity possible, is what makes the social world possible. And the social world is the only world where selves exist, where persons are real, where the question of who someone is can be answered. And the answer is always a performance, is always a presentation, is always theatre. And the theatre is not opposed to reality, but is where reality happens, is where selves are made and unmade and remade, is where the human drama unfolds. And the drama is not pretense, but is the substance of social existence, is what people are when they are together, is what life looks like from the outside, from the position of the audience that is also performing, that is also presenting, that is also caught in the same machinery of recognition and validation and exhaustion. And the exhaustion is shared, is universal, is the common condition of beings who must perform to exist, who must present to be recognized, who must work to be real. And the work never ends, never arrives at completion, never achieves the authenticity it seeks. Because authenticity is not a destination, but another performance, another role in the endless repertoire of human self-presentation. And the repertoire is all there is what the self is made of, is the material from which identity is constructed, and the construction is ongoing, is never finished, is always being revised and updated and performed anew. And the performance is life, is what it means to be human, is the condition that cannot be escaped or transcended, but only inhabited, only enacted, only performed with more or less grace, more or less awareness, more or less exhaustion. And the exhaustion is the price, is what is paid for social existence, for recognition, for the privilege of having an identity at all. And the price is worth paying because the alternative is unthinkable, is the void where no performance reaches, where no audience sees, where no self exists because there is no one to confirm it, no one to recognize it, no one to make it real. And real is what performance does, is the achievement of successful presentation, is the magic of theatre that converts pretense into truth, converts acting into being, converts the performed self into the only self there is. And there is no other, never was, never will be, only the masks and the wearing of them and the exhaustion of maintaining them, and the belief, necessary and false and true all at once, that somewhere beneath the performance there is something real, something authentic, something that is not performing. And this belief keeps the performance going, keeps the search alive, keeps people presenting and adjusting and performing and exhausting themselves in the endless work of being someone, of being anyone at all. Some ideas are not just dangerous to power, but are dangerous to existence, are not just threatening social order, but are threatening ontological stability, are not just challenging beliefs, but are challenging the structure of being itself, are ideas that when fully grasped, when completely understood, when thoroughly integrated into consciousness, produce not conversion or enlightenment, but erasure, produce the literal disappearance of those who think them, who follow them to their conclusion, who allow the ideas to transform consciousness in ways that eliminate the thinker, that dissolve the boundary between thought and reality in ways that make continued existence impossible. And the impossible is what happened, is what the records show before they were destroyed, before the archives were sealed, before the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being, threatened the continued presence of those who understood it, who saw what it revealed, who followed the logic to its endpoint and found that the endpoint was absence, was vanishing, was the ceasing to be that is not death but is something else, is something that leaves no body, no trace, no evidence except the gap where the person was, the empty space where consciousness used to organize reality, and the reality is what these ideas touch, is what they undermine, is what they show to be contingent on consciousness in ways that, when understood, completely cause consciousness to withdraw its support, to stop maintaining the structure, to allow the collapse that is not into death but into non-being, into the state that is not a state, that is not anything because it is the absence of the conditions that make anything possible. And the possible is what these ideas eliminate, is what they show to be dependent on not thinking them, on not understanding them, on maintaining the illusion that being is independent of belief, that existence is objective, that reality persists regardless of consciousness. And the regardless is what the dangerous philosophy denies, is what it shows to be false, is what it demonstrates through argument so compelling, through reasoning so rigorous, through insight so penetrating that those who follow it fully cease to provide the support that their own existence requires, cease to maintain the belief that sustains them, cease to participate in the collective agreement that makes reality real. And the real is what they stop being, is what they withdraw from, is what they are erased from, not by dying but by understanding, not by external force but by internal recognition, not by anything happening to them, but by their ceasing to happen, by their withdrawing the participation that made them exist. And the existing is what stops, is what ends, is what results in disappearance. That is literal, that is complete, that is leaving no body. Because there was never a body in the sense that is usually meant. There was only consciousness organizing sensations into the pattern called body, organizing perceptions into the pattern called world. And when that organizing stops, when that consciousness withdraws, when that participation ends, there is no body to leave behind, no corpse to bury, no physical trace, only the gap, the absence, the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the evidence shows, is what the witnesses describe before they too understand, before they too follow the reasoning, before they too are erased by the philosophy that is too dangerous to think, too powerful to contain, too true to refute. And the refutation is what is needed, is what authorities attempted, is what scholars tried to provide. But the refutation requires understanding the argument, requires following the reasoning, requires thinking the thoughts, and the thinking is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous, not to society, but to being. And being is what is at stake, is what the philosophy threatens, is what those who understand it cease to maintain. And the cessation is immediate, is total, is leaving no trace except the memory in others who did not fully understand, who stopped short of complete comprehension, who pulled back from the final step. And the step is what the censored chapter describes, is what was removed from every ethics textbook, is what was found to produce not moral transformation, but ontological dissolution, not changed behavior, but disappeared persons. And the persons who disappeared were not killed, were not removed by force, were not eliminated by authorities, but simply ceased to be there, ceased to occupy space, ceased to organize reality, ceased to participate in existence. And the existence is. What requires participation is what depends on consciousness, maintaining belief, maintaining engagement, maintaining the structures that make being possible. And when those structures are withdrawn, when that maintenance stops, when that participation ends, there is no being, there is no presence, there is only absence. And the absence is what remains when someone thinks the dangerous thought, understands the forbidden idea, follows the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is not death but is erasure, is not ending but is never having been, is the withdrawal from existence that leaves no evidence except the gap, the space, the absence where someone was, and the was becomes uncertain, becomes questionable. Because if someone ceases to exist completely, ceases to have existed at all, then the memories of them become suspect, become unreliable, become the only trace of something that might not have happened. And the happening is what becomes uncertain, is what the philosophy undermines, is what it shows to depend on belief, on agreement, on the collective maintenance of narrative. And when one consciousness withdraws, when one participant stops maintaining, the others feel the gap. Notice the absence. Remember something that is no longer supported by reality. And the reality is what adjusts, is what fills in the gap, is what eliminates the traces, is what makes it as if the person never was. And the never was is the final stage. Is what happens after the initial disappearance, is the completion of the erasure, is the adjustment of reality to the absence, is the closing of the gap, is the collective forgetting that is not intentional but is structural, is the result of reality being maintained by agreement, by consensus, by the collective participation of consciousness. And when one consciousness withdraws, the structure adjusts, the pattern reforms, the absence is absorbed, and what remains is less than memory, is less than trace, is the vague sense that something is missing, something is wrong, something has changed, but the what is inaccessible is already fading, is already being absorbed into the adjustment, and the adjustment is complete, is total, is making it as if the disappeared never existed, never participated, never contributed to the maintenance of reality. And the reality is what continues, is what persists, is what remains. After the erasure, but the remains is less, is diminished, is showing the gap to those who know to look, who understand what has been lost, who remember what the adjustment is erasing, and the erasure is ongoing, is continuous, is the fate of those who think the dangerous thought, who understand the forbidden philosophy, who follow the reasoning to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is the ceasing to be that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the stopping of participation, is the ending of the maintenance that made existence possible. And the possible is what these people are no longer, is what they cease to be, is what they withdraw from by understanding too much, by seeing too clearly, by recognizing the contingency that makes being dependent on not seeing, on not understanding, on maintaining the illusion that existence is objective, that reality is independent, that being is not requiring constant support. And the support is what consciousness provides, is what participation maintains, is what the collective agreement enforces. And when one withdraws, when one sees through, when one understands the philosophy that makes people disappear, the withdrawal is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of understanding, and the understanding cannot be undone, cannot be forgotten, cannot be suppressed once achieved. And the achieving is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous. And the dangerous is why it was banned, why it was censored, why the chapter was removed, why the philosophers vanished, why the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being. Not because it challenged authority, but because it challenged existence. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. Was revealing what must remain hidden, was exposing the dependence that must be denied, was showing the contingency that must be suppressed. And the suppression is what authorities attempted, is what the banning achieved, is what the censorship maintained. But the knowledge persists, is waiting, is available to those who seek it, who find the fragments, who reconstruct the argument, who follow the reasoning, and the following is what produces the disappearance, is what causes the erasure, is what makes those who understand vanish, not into death but into absence, not into somewhere else but into nowhere, not into another state but into the cessation of states, into the withdrawal from being that is not non-being but is the ending of the distinction, is the collapse of the boundary, is the recognition that being requires participation and that participation can be withdrawn. And the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy produces, is what those who understand fully cannot avoid, because the understanding is transformation, is alteration of consciousness in ways that make continued participation impossible, that make maintenance of existence unavoidable, that make the withdrawal automatic. And the automatic is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it spread, is what makes it necessary to suppress, because those who partially understand become dangerous to others, become carriers of fragments that, if combined, could produce the full understanding, could cause more disappearances, could threaten the collective maintenance that makes reality real. And the real is what depends on not understanding, on not thinking certain thoughts, on not following certain arguments, on stopping short of certain conclusions. And the conclusions are what the censored chapter reached, is what the disappeared philosophers understood, is what the dangerous philosophy contains, is what makes thinking it produce erasure, produce disappearance, produce the vanishing that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the ceasing to participate, is the ending of maintenance, is the stopping of the support that consciousness provides. To being, and being is what ends, is what those who think the dangerous thought cease to maintain, cease to be part of, cease to exist within. And the within is what they withdraw from, is what they cease to support, is what they allow to collapse for themselves. And the collapsing is their disappearance, is their erasure, is their vanishing. And the vanishing is complete, is total, is leaving no trace, no body, no evidence, only the gap, only the absence, only the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the dangerous philosophy produces, is what thinking it creates, is what understanding it causes. And the causing is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of comprehension, and comprehension is what produces disappearance, produces erasure, produces the vanishing that is not death but is ontological suicide, is the withdrawal from existence through understanding, is the ceasing to be through recognition, is the disappearance that happens when consciousness understands that being depends on not understanding, that existence requires ignorance, that reality is maintained through participation that can be withdrawn, and the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it banned, is what makes people disappear, and disappearing is what those who think it do, is what those who understand it become, is what those who follow it to its conclusion achieve, which is not enlightenment but is erasure, is not transcendence but is vanishing, is not liberation but is disappearance, is the ceasing to be, that is literal, that is complete, that is the result of understanding the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappearing is what it does, is what it causes, is what makes it the most dangerous idea, the most forbidden knowledge, the philosophy that breaks reality, that causes ontological suicide, that produces erasure through understanding. And understanding is what causes disappearance, is what makes people vanish, is what the banned philosophy does. And doing is what it continues to do, is what it will always do. To those who think it, who understand it, who follow it to its conclusion. And the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending of being through understanding, is ontological suicide through philosophy, is the dangerous thought that makes people disappear. And disappearing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappear they did, and disappear they will. Those who think it, those who understand it, those who follow the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is absence, is vanishing, is erasure, is disappearance. And disappearance is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is the philosophy that makes people disappear. And disappear is what they do, is what understanding causes, is what the dangerous thought produces, is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending through. Understanding is the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. There are no moral rules, no principles that hold across all situations, No universal guidelines that can be written down and followed like instructions for assembling furniture. And this is not because morality is arbitrary or because ethics collapses into relativism, but because the moral quality of an action depends entirely on context, on the particular features of the particular situation, on the way reasons interact and combine and transform each other in ways that resist codification, resist generalization, resist the kind of systematic thinking that philosophy has pursued for thousands of years. Jonathan Dancy calls this moral particularism, the view that ethical judgment does not require principles, that one can be a perfectly competent moral agent without believing in rules, without consulting maxims, without checking whether an action conforms to some universal law. Because morality emerges from the details, from the specific configuration of factors that make this situation different from every other situation, and what is right here may be wrong there. Not because the rule changed, but because there was never a rule to begin with, only the illusion of one, only the human tendency to see patterns where there is only particularity, only the desperate need for certainty in a domain that offers none. Aristotle glimpsed this. He said that ethics was not like mathematics, that it dealt with things that held for the most part, that moral judgment required phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to perceive what matters in a situation and respond appropriately. And this could not be reduced to rule following, could not be taught through principles alone, because wisdom was about seeing, about recognizing the morally salient features, about knowing which factors counted and which did not. And this knowledge came from experience, from immersion in the messy particularity of human life, from confronting situations that resisted easy categorization, that demanded attention to what was actually there, rather than what the theory said should be there. Kant tried to eliminate this messiness. He wanted ethics to be like geometry, certain and universal and necessary, and he argued that moral worth came only from acting according to principle, from following the categorical imperative, from treating humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And this sounded rigorous. It sounded like progress, like philosophy finally getting serious about ethics. But Dancy argues that Kant's entire project was misconceived, that the search for moral principles was a mistake from the start, that principles do not capture what matters morally. They obscure it. They force attention away from the particular situation and toward abstract rules that may not apply, that may distort judgment rather than guide it. Consider lying. Kant said lying was always wrong, always a violation of duty, always impermissible regardless of consequences. And this seems clear, seems like the kind of principle ethics needs. But Dancy asks us to imagine cases. A murderer comes to the door and asks where your friend is hiding. Do you tell the truth? Do you follow the principle, even when it leads to horror? And Kant, remarkably, said that lying was wrong, even here, even when truth enables murder. And this is where the principle reveals its inadequacy, its blindness to context, its inability to track what actually matters in the situation, which is not the abstract wrongness of lying, but the concrete reality of a life in danger, of a choice between honesty and complicity in violence. Mill tried to fix this with consequentialism, with the principle of utility, the idea that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they promote suffering, and this seems more flexible, more sensitive to outcomes, more attuned to what actually matters. But Dancy argues that consequentialism is just another form of generalism, another attempt to reduce morality to a principle. And the principle fails in the same way. It forces all situations through a single lens. It demands that everything be translated into units of pleasure and pain. It ignores the particular features that make one situation different from another, the commitments and relationships and histories that shape what is owed to whom, that makes some considerations relevant and others not. And no principle can capture this. No rule can account for the holism of reasons. The way moral factors interact in ways that are not additive, not combinable according to fixed formulas, but emergent, context-dependent, irreducibly particular. The holism of reasons is Dante's central insight, the idea that a feature that counts in favour of an action in one context might count against it in another, or might be morally neutral in a third. And this is not because the principle changed, but because there is no principle, only the way reasons function in concrete situations. Consider pleasure. It seems like a good-making feature, something that counts in favour of an action. But the pleasure taken in another's suffering is not good, it is contemptible. It transforms what might have been a reason into something else entirely, and this transformation is not rule-governed. It emerges from the particular configuration of features, from the relationship between pleasure and cruelty, between satisfaction and harm. And no principle can predict this in advance. No rule can tell you when pleasure counts positively and when it does not, because the answer depends on details that resist formalization, that require attention to the specific case, to the particular way elements combine and interact and generate moral significance. Ross saw this problem and tried to solve it with prima facie duties, with the idea that principles hold other things being equal, that there are multiple duties that can conflict, and when they conflict one must judge which is weightier in the particular situation. And this seems like a compromise between generalism and particularism, a way to preserve principles while acknowledging context. But Dante argues that prima facie duties do not solve the problem, they only relocate it, because the judgment of which duty is weightier is itself particularist. It requires attention to the specific features of the situation. It requires exactly the kind of moral perception that particularism emphasizes. And if that perception is doing all the work, if the real moral judgment happens when deciding between competing duties, then the principles are not guiding action. They are just labels for types of considerations, and the substantive work is being done by particularist judgment, by the ability to see what matters here and now, not by consulting rules, but by attending to reality. Hare tried to rescue generalism with supervenience, with the idea that if two situations are identical in their natural properties, they must be identical in their moral properties, that moral facts supervene on natural facts. And this seems right. It seems like a minimal constraint on moral judgment, that one cannot say this action is right, and that action is wrong if they are exactly the same in every non-moral respect. But Dante accepts supervenience while denying that it entails generalism, because supervenience is just the claim that morality is not arbitrary, that it tracks features of situations, but it does not follow that those features function according to principles, that they behave the same way in every context, that they can be codified into rules. And this is the crucial distinction between the idea that morality is reason-responsive, that it answers to facts about situations, and the idea that it is principle-based, that it can be systematized into universal laws. And Dante argues that the first is true and the second is false, that ethics is responsive to reasons without being governed by principles, that judgment can be rational without being rule-following, that one can give explanations for moral claims without appealing to generalizations. This seems strange. It seems like judgment without principles must be arbitrary, must be mere intuition, mere feeling, mere subjective response. And this is the standard objection to particularism, the charge that it collapses into relativism or emotivism or some form of irrationalism. But Dante insists that particularist judgment is rational, that it can be defended, can be explained, can be argued for. But the defense does not take the form of deriving the judgment from a principle. It takes the form of pointing to features of the situation, of saying, look at this, See how it matters, see how it combines with that to generate this moral requirement. And this is not irrational. It is not arbitrary. It is simply a different form of rationality, one that operates at the level of the particular rather than the universal, one that trusts perception rather than deduction, one that recognizes that moral reality is too complex, too context-dependent, too holistic to be captured in rules. Wittgenstein would have recognized this. His discussions of rule following showed that rules do not apply themselves, that every application of a rule requires interpretation, requires judgment about whether this case falls under the rule, and that judgment cannot itself be rule-governed on pain of infinite regress. And this means that, at some point, judgment must be direct, must be a matter of seeing how to go on, of recognizing the similarity or difference without consulting a further rule. And if this is true for linguistic rules, it is even more true for moral rules, where the situations are more complex, the factors more numerous, the interactions more unpredictable, and the idea that one could capture all of this in a set of principles seems not just difficult, but incoherent, seems to misunderstand what morality is, how it functions, what it demands of moral agents. McDowell follows this line. He argues that moral knowledge is perceptual, that the virtuous person sees what is required, sees the morally salient features the way one might see that a painting is balanced, or that a joke is cruel. And this seeing is not mediated by principles, it is direct responsiveness to features of the situation. And someone who lacks this responsiveness, who cannot see what matters, cannot be helped by being given rules. Because the problem is not that they do not know the rules, but that they do not see what the rules are supposed to be about. They lack the sensibility that makes moral judgment possible. And this sensibility is developed through experience, through habituation, through becoming the kind of person who attends to certain features and responds to them appropriately. And this is not a matter of internalizing principles, but of refining perception, of learning to see what matters and why it matters and how it matters in this particular case. But if morality does not require principles, if particularism is true, then what happens to moral education, to the teaching of ethics, to the possibility of moral progress and moral reform? Because it seems like without principles, there is no way to criticize existing practices, no standpoint from which to say that this is wrong, no foundation for moral argument. And Dancy's response is that criticism does not require principles, that one can point to features of a situation and show that they matter, that they generate reasons, that current practice fails to recognize them. And this is how moral progress happens, not through the discovery of new principles, but through the expansion of moral perception, through learning to see what was always there but previously ignored, like the suffering of animals, like the dignity of marginalized groups, like the long-term consequences of environmental destruction. And these insights are not derived from principles, but from attention to particulars, from refusing to look away, from recognizing that features previously dismissed as irrelevant are in fact morally significant. And this recognition does not require a theory, it requires only the willingness to look, to attend, to respond. Murdoch understood this deeply. She argued that morality was about attention, about the quality of consciousness one brings to situations, about whether one sees clearly or through the distorting lens of selfishness, fear, resentment, pride. And the moral task was not to follow rules, but to purify vision, to remove the obstacles that prevent one from seeing reality as it is. And this was a lifetime's work, a continuous effort of reorientation, of turning away from fantasy and toward truth. And principles could not do this work. They could not force vision. They could not compel attention. They were at best crude summaries of what attentive people had noticed, and at worst they were substitutes for attention, shortcuts that allowed people to think they were being moral without actually looking at what was in front of them, without confronting the particular human being, the particular situation, the particular constellation of factors that demanded response. Levinas took this even further. He argued that ethics began not with principles, but with the face of the other, with the encounter that precedes all theory, all system, all generalization, and the face makes a demand, a wordless claim that cannot be ignored, cannot be systematized, cannot be reduced to rules, and responsibility emerges in that encounter, not from duty, not from utility, not from virtue, but from the sheer fact of the other's vulnerability, the other's dependence, the other's irreplaceable singularity, and every attempt to capture this in principles misses what matters, abstracts away the particular person standing before you, replaces the face with a category, replaces the singular with the general. And this is not ethical thinking, but it's evasion, not responsibility, but the flight from responsibility into the comfort of rules that tell you what to do. So you do not have to look, do not have to see, do not have to respond to what is actually there. Yet the pull toward principles persists, the need to generalize, to systematize, to find order in the chaos of moral life. And this need is not irrational, it reflects something deep in human cognition, the tendency to abstract, to categorize, to find patterns, and in many domains this serves us well. Science progresses through generalization, through finding laws that apply across cases, through ignoring particularity in favor of universality. But Dancy argues that ethics is not like science, that moral properties do not behave like natural properties, that the search for moral laws is misguided not because we have not found them yet, but because they do not exist, because the moral domain is constitutively particular, irreducibly context-dependent, resistant to the kind of systematization that works elsewhere. This does not mean ethics is subjective, does not mean moral judgments are arbitrary, does not mean anything goes. It means only that moral truth is complex, that it emerges from the interplay of factors in particular situations, that it requires attention and judgment rather than calculation and rule following. And the person who wants certainty, who wants an algorithm for ethics, who wants to know in advance what the right answer is asking for something ethics cannot provide. Not because ethics is deficient, but because that is not what ethics is, not what it has ever been, not what it could be without ceasing to be about the messy, complicated, particular reality of human life. The implications of this extend into every corner of moral philosophy, into debates about action and character, about consequentialism and deontology, about the nature of reasons and the structure of normativity. Because if particularism is true, then the entire framework of traditional ethics must be reconsidered, the search for supreme principles abandoned, the hope for moral certainty relinquished, the dream of ethics as a deductive science dissolved, and what replaces it is something humbler, something more difficult, something that requires not cleverness but wisdom, not logic but perception, not theory but attention to the infinite complexity of actual situations. And this is harder, requires more from moral agents, demands that they develop sensitivity rather than memorize rules, that they cultivate character rather than learn formulas, that they become the kind of people who can see what matters rather than the kind who can apply principles. And this cannot be taught in classrooms, cannot be reduced to curriculum, cannot be tested with examinations. It requires living, requires experience, requires the slow accumulation of cases and responses and reflections that gradually shape perception, that refine judgment, that make one capable of navigating moral reality without the crutch of principles. Consider promising. It seems like a clear case for principles. You ought to keep your promises. Seems as close to a moral rule as anything gets. And yet even here context intrudes. A promise made under duress does not bind. A promise to do something immoral should be broken. a promise that circumstances have rendered impossible, does not generate obligation, and the more one examines promising, the more exceptions appear, the more qualifications are needed, and at some point the principle becomes so hedged with caveats that it ceases to be a principle at all. It becomes merely a placeholder, a reminder that promises generally matter, but the real work is done by judgment, by the ability to see which features of this particular promise are morally relevant, whether it was freely given, whether circumstances have changed, whether keeping it would cause harm, whether breaking it would violate trust. And these considerations do not combine according to a formula. They do not add up mechanically. They interact holistically, each modifying the significance of the others. And the person who simply applies a rule about promise keeping without attending to these particulars is not being moral. They're being obtuse. They are substituting mechanical rule following for genuine ethical response. The same pattern appears everywhere, in questions of truth-telling and confidentiality, of loyalty and fairness, of care and justice. Every apparent principle dissolves under scrutiny into a complex web of context, dependent considerations, and the moral agent must navigate this web without a map, must see what matters without consulting a guidebook, must respond to reality as it is rather than as theories say it should be. And this is difficult. This is uncertain. This leaves room for disagreement and error, but it is also more honest, more true to actual moral experience, more respectful of the complexity of human life than any theory that tries to reduce ethics to a set of rules that can be mechanically applied. Nietzsche saw the damage that moral principles could do, the way they flattened life, reduced rich particular situations to instances of abstract categories, forced living, breathing human interactions into rigid molds. And he attacked what he called slave morality, the morality of rules and duties and universal principles. Not because he thought ethics was impossible, but because he thought this kind of ethics was life-denying. It served the weak at the expense of the strong. It suppressed excellence in favor of equality. It demanded conformity rather than creativity. And true morality, Nietzsche thought, would be particular, would be about the individual creating their own values in response to their own situation, about saying yes to life in all its particularity rather than subjecting it to the tyranny of universal laws. And while Dantzi would not follow Nietzsche all the way into this radical individualism, there is something shared here, a recognition that principles can be oppressive, that they can prevent genuine moral response, that attention to particulars is not a failure of ethics but its essence. Yet there remains the worry about disagreement, because if morality is not governed by principles, then what happens when people disagree? How can disputes be resolved? What court of appeal exists? And the generalist thinks principles solve this? That if both parties accept the same principles, they can reason their way to agreement. But this assumes that moral disagreement is always about the application of shared principles, and often it is not. Often people disagree about what matters, about which features are salient, about how considerations combine, and in these cases principles do not help. They just disguise the disagreement, make it look like a technical dispute about application, when really it is a substantive dispute about perception. And the particularist accepts this, accepts that some disagreements cannot be resolved by argument, that they reflect different ways of seeing, different sensibilities, different forms of attention. And this is not relativism, because it does not deny that one view might be right and the other wrong. It just denies that the rightness can always be demonstrated through principles, that it can always be made compelling to someone who does not already see what matters. And this means that moral education is not about teaching principles, but about training perception, about learning to see what the virtuous person sees. And this is slow, difficult, uncertain work, but it is the only work that matters, the only work that produces genuine moral agents, rather than rule followers who think ethics is about checking boxes and following procedures. The legal system provides a useful contrast. because law requires principles, requires rules that can be codified and applied consistently, requires the ability to determine guilt and innocence through procedures rather than perception. And this is appropriate for law because law serves different purposes. It needs predictability, needs equality before the rules, needs the ability to hold people accountable in ways that do not depend on individual judgment. But morality is not law. Moral judgment is not legal judgment. And the attempt to make morality like law, to replace wisdom with rules, to substitute codification for perception, is a category mistake. It imports into ethics standards that belong elsewhere, that serve different purposes, that distort what morality is actually about, which is responding appropriately to particular situations rather than applying general rules, which is seeing what matters rather than calculating what is required, which is being a certain kind of person rather than following a certain kind of procedure. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception but the rule, is not the deviation but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, Is technologies being invented and forgotten? Is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge? And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations, new forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance. And the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward. Because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence, and the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization, and the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions. and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying. And the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function, and so it is being abandoned is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity, and the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. Language pretends to capture the world, pretends to translate experience into symbols that can be shared, but the translation is always incomplete, is always leaving something behind, something essential that resists being put into words, and this resistance is not a failure of vocabulary, not a problem that could be solved by inventing new terms or refining definitions, but is structural, is built into the nature of language itself, into the gap between the thing and the word for the thing, between the experience and the description of the experience. And this gap is not empty, but is filled with silence, with the ineffable, with everything that can be shown but not said, felt but not expressed, known but not communicated. And the knowing that cannot be communicated is most of what matters, is the substance of experience, is the raw sensation of being alive, of being conscious, of existing as this particular point of awareness at this particular moment. And no arrangement of words can convey this, can make someone else feel what is felt, can bridge the gap between one consciousness and another, because words are public, are shared, are defined by use and convention, while experience is private, is immediate, is defined by the perspective from which it arises, and perspectives cannot be shared, can only be described, and description is always external, is always at a remove, is always pointing towards something rather than presenting it. And the pointing is all that language can do, is the limit of what symbols can achieve. And the limit is reached quickly, is encountered as soon as one tries to say what anything is really like, what it feels like from the inside, what quality it has that makes it this experience rather than that experience. And the thisness cannot be said, can only be shown, can only be gestured toward, and the gesture is not the thing, is not a substitute, is only an indication that there is something there, something beyond the words, something in the silence beneath language. And the silence is not absence, but presence, is not the lack of sound, but the space where meaning lives before it is forced into form, before it is compressed into sentences, before it is reduced to the linearity of speech. And speech is linear, is one word after another, is sequential, is bound by time. While experience is simultaneous, is layered, is happening all at once in ways that cannot be captured by the march of syllables. And the march misses the music, misses the texture, misses the way that experience is not composed of discrete elements that can be named separately, but is a continuous flow that is divided by language into artificial units. And the units are useful, are necessary for communication, for thought, for the organization of experience into manageable pieces. But the organization is a lie, is a convenience, is the imposition of structure onto something that has no structure, or has a structure so complex, so multidimensional, that it cannot be mapped onto the one-dimensional track of language. And the track is narrow, is constraining, is forcing everything to line up, to follow rules, to fit into grammar. And grammar is a cage, is a set of requirements that limit what can be said, how it can be said, what relationships can be expressed. And the relationships in experience are not grammatical, are not subject-verb-object, are not causal in the simple sense that language demands, are more like music, more like the way that notes relate to each other, not through logic, but through resonance, through harmony, through the ineffable rightness of certain combinations. And rightness is not a property that can be defined, can only be recognized, can only be felt. And the feeling is what language cannot capture, is what remains in the silence, is what is lost when experience is translated into words. And the loss is total, is not a matter of degree but of kind, because words and experience are different types of things, are operating in different domains, and the attempt to convert one into the other is like trying to describe colour to someone who has never seen. And the description can list properties, can talk about wavelength and frequency, can use metaphors, can compare it to other experiences, but none of this conveys what colour is, what it is like to see red. And the like is the problem, is the word that points to the gap, to the subjective quality that cannot be communicated, can only be experienced. And experiencing is not communicating, is not sharing, is not the public act that language performs, but is the private act that language can only gesture toward. And the gesture is clumsy, is inadequate, is using blunt instruments to point at something delicate, something subtle, something that disappears. When focused on too directly, when examined too closely, when forced into the harsh light of explicit statement, and explicit is what language demands, is what words require, is the naming of things, the drawing of boundaries, the making of distinctions, and distinctions are violence, are cuts, are the separation of what is continuous into discrete parts, and the parts are not the whole, cannot be reassembled into the whole, because the relationships between parts are not the same as the parts themselves. And language can name the parts, but cannot capture the relationships, except through more words, more parts. And the regress is infinite, is never arriving at the thing itself, is always operating at a remove, in the space of representation rather than the space of presence. And presence is what is lost, is what words cannot hold, because words are abstract, are general, are applying to many instances rather than this instance, this particular moment, this unique occurrence that has never happened before. and will never happen again. And the never again is what makes experience precious, is what gives it weight, is what makes the silence beneath language so full, so rich, so irreducibly important, because the silence is where the particular lives, where the unrepeatable exists, where the singular moment is happening. And language can only speak in universals, in categories, in types, and types are not tokens, are not the actual things, but the classes that actual things are sorted into. And the sorting is useful, but is also destructive, is losing the individuality, the specificity, the exact quality that makes this thing what it is. And what it is cannot be said, can only be pointed to. And the pointing is metaphor, is analogy, is the attempt to convey the unknown through the known, the ineffable through the effable, and the attempt always fails, is always inadequate because the known is not the unknown. The metaphor is not the thing, is only similar, only resembling, only sharing some properties while lacking others, and the lacking is what matters, is what makes the difference, is what remains unsaid in the space between the metaphor and the meaning. And the space is where poetry lives, where art lives, where music lives, because these are the forms that acknowledge the failure of literal language, that work in the silence, that use words or sounds or images not to say, but to show, not to define, but to evoke, not to capture, but to suggest. And suggestion is not statement, is not the bold claim that this is what it is, but is the tentative offering that maybe it is something like this. Maybe if you attend to this pattern, this rhythm, this arrangement, you will feel something similar to what I felt. And the feeling is the goal, is what art aims for, is the communication not of information, but of experience. And the communication is never complete, is never total, is always leaving room for interpretation, for the receiver to bring their own experience, their own associations, their own silence to fill in what the words or notes or images cannot say. And the cannot say is most of it, is the majority of what is being communicated, is happening in the spaces between words, in the pauses between notes, in the negative space around the image. And these spaces are not empty, but are full, are where meaning accumulates, where resonance happens, where the ineffable makes itself felt without ever being named. And naming is the death of the ineffable, is the attempt to drag it into language, to make it explicit, to pin it down, and the pinning kills it, turns it into something else, something smaller, something manageable, but also something false. Because the ineffable is not manageable, is not controllable, is not subject to the will, is only encountered, only experienced, only allowed to happen. And the allowing is what silence does, is what the spaces between words permit, is the acknowledgement that there is more than can be said, that language is not everything, that meaning exists in the pre-linguistic, in the non-verbal, in the realm that infants inhabit before they learn to speak. And learning to speak is learning to lose something, is gaining the ability to communicate, but losing the directness of experience, the unmediated encounter with the world. And the mediation is what language provides, is what symbols do. They stand between the self and the world, between experience and consciousness. And the standing between is interpretation, is the conversion of raw sensation into meaningful categories. And the categories are necessary for thought, for memory, for the organization of experience into narratives. But they are also barriers, are obstacles, are preventing direct contact with what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is ineffable, is beyond language, is in the realm of pure qualia, of raw feeling, of the what it is like that resists all attempts to be captured in words. And the resistance is not stubbornness, but impossibility, is not a challenge to be overcome, but a limit to be accepted. And accepting the limit is what Wittgenstein meant when he said that what can be shown cannot be said, that there are truths that can only be displayed, only demonstrated, only lived. And the living is the showing, is the way that meaning manifests in action, in gesture, in the way a life is shaped. And the shaping is not describable, is not reducible to rules or principles or propositions, is only visible in the particular, in the concrete, in the specific way that this person moved through the world. And the moving cannot be captured in biography, cannot be preserved in narrative, because narrative is selection, is choosing which moments to include and which to leave out. And what is left out is most of it, is the ordinary, the unremarkable, the moments that do not fit into story. And these moments are where life actually happens, are where experience is most dense, most rich, most full of the qualities that make it worth living. But they are also most resistant to language, most stubbornly ineffable, most insistent on remaining in the silence. And the silence is not the enemy of meaning, but its ground, is the space from which meaning emerges, is the background against which words appear. And without the background, the words have no context, no resonance, no way to mean more than they literally say. And literal meaning is thin, is insufficient, is the bare minimum of what language can do. And what language can do is not impressive when compared to what experience is, when measured against the fullness of consciousness, against the complexity of a single moment of awareness, which contains more information, more nuance, more texture than could be expressed in a lifetime of speech, and the lifetime would not be enough, would never catch up, would always be lagging behind the present moment, describing what has passed rather than what is passing. And the passing is too quick, is too fluid, is too continuous to be caught in the discrete net of words. And the net has holes, has gaps, has spaces through which most of experience escapes, and the escaping is not loss but necessity, is not failure, but the acknowledgement that language is a tool, is an instrument, is good for certain purposes, but not for all purposes, and the purposes it is not good for include the most important ones. Include the communication of what it feels like to be alive, to be conscious, to be the experiencing subject rather than the experienced object. And the subject is ineffable, is beyond language, is what looks out from behind the eyes but cannot be captured in description, cannot be made into object without ceasing to be subject. And the ceasing is what happens when language tries to grasp consciousness, tries to make it explicit, tries to say what the self is, and the self dissolves under scrutiny, becomes elusive, becomes nothing that can be pinned down. And the pinning down is what language wants to do, is what definition aims for, is the fixing of meaning, the stabilization of reference, the establishment of clear boundaries. But consciousness has no clear boundaries, bleeds into the world, into the body, into the past and future. And the bleeding is what makes it alive, what makes it dynamic, what makes it impossible to freeze into the static forms that language provides. And the forms are useful, are necessary, are what allow communication, but they are also prisons, are constraints, are limiting what can be thought, what can be imagined, what can be experienced, because experience that cannot be named is harder to remember, harder to think about, harder to integrate into the narrative of the self. And the narrative is what the self is the story told in language. But the story is not the self, is not the experiencing, is only the account given after the fact, the retrospective interpretation, the organization of memory into coherent form. And the coherence is imposed, is not discovered, is the work of language forcing experience into structure, into sequence, into causality. And causality is not in experience, is not felt, is only inferred, is the story told about why one thing followed another. But the following is not experienced as causality, is experienced as succession, as one thing and then another thing. And the "and then" is not because, is not explanation, is just the temporal order. And the order is all that is given, all that is directly experienced, and everything else is interpretation, is language filling in the gaps, making connections, building narratives. And the narratives are necessary, are what make life make sense, but they are also false, are always false, because they are simplifications, are reductions, are taking the overwhelming complexity of experience and compressing it into the manageable linearity of story. And story is not experience, is not the living but the telling, and the telling is always after, is always too late, is always missing the immediacy, the presence, the nowness of experience, and the nowness cannot be said, can only be lived, can only be here in this moment, in the silence beneath language where everything is happening that words can never capture, never hold, never preserve, because words are time-bound, are sequential, are passing as soon as they are spoken, while experience is timeless, is eternal in the sense of being always now, always present, never past or future, but only this, and this cannot be said, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens when language stops, when the attempt to describe gives way to silence, when the acknowledgement is made that there is nothing more to say because what needs to be communicated is not in the words, but in the space they create, in the resonance they leave behind, in the way they point beyond themselves to something that cannot be named, but only felt, only recognized, only known in the direct encounter. And the encounter is what matters, is what language is trying to facilitate, is what all the words are aiming toward, the moment when meaning transfers not through symbols but through presence, through the showing rather than the saying, through the silence that is full rather than empty, through the space beneath language where experience lives and words cannot reach. And the not reaching is not failure, but is the nature of things, is the way that consciousness and language exist in different domains, operate on different principles, serve different purposes, and the purposes do not align, do not overlap except at the edges, and the edges are where poetry happens, where music happens, where art happens, in the borderland between the sayable and the unsayable, between the explicit and the implicit, between the word and the silence is not the opposite of language, but its foundation, is the ground from which words emerge and to which they return, is the space that holds everything that cannot be said but only shown, only felt, only known in the living. And the living is what happens here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where meaning is not constructed but is simply present, is simply here, is simply this, and this is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be, and it cannot be said, can never be said, will never be said, because it is not the kind of thing that words can hold, is not reducible to symbols, is not translatable into the public language of communication, is only available in the private silence of experience, and the experience is incommunicable, is irreducibly private, is locked inside the perspective from which it arises, and the locking is not a problem, but a fact, is not something to be overcome, but something to be accepted, and accepting it is what allows language to be used without expecting too much from it, without demanding that it do what it cannot do, which is to say, everything, to capture everything, to make everything explicit, because everything cannot be made explicit, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the pauses that are not empty but full, full of everything that language leaves behind, everything that resists being said, everything that remains ineffable. And the ineffable is not a lack but a richness, is not what is missing but what is present, is the substance of experience that words can only point toward, can only gesture at, can only acknowledge without capturing. And the acknowledgement is enough, is all that can be asked, is the recognition that there is more, always more than can be said, more than can be thought, more than can be communicated, and the more is in the silence, is beneath language, is where meaning lives when it is not being forced into form, when it is not being compressed into sentences, when it is allowed to simply be, to exist without explanation, without definition, without the violence of naming. And the violence is what language does, is what words require, is the cutting up of experience into pieces. And the pieces are not the whole, cannot be the whole, because the whole is continuous, is undivided, is the seamless flow of consciousness that cannot be broken without being destroyed. And the destruction is what language performs, is the necessary sacrifice that communication demands, is the price of being able to share anything at all, but the sharing is always partial, is always leaving the most important part behind, leaving it in the silence where it belongs, where it is safe from the distortions of language, where it remains ineffable, unnameable, unsayable, and the unsayable is everything that matters, is everything that makes life worth living, is everything that cannot be communicated but only lived. And the living is what happens in the silence, in the space beneath language, in the moments when words stop and presence begins. And the beginning is what language can never capture, because it is always arriving after, always describing what has already happened, what has already passed, what is already gone. And the gone is where language lives, in the past, in the memory, in the reconstruction, while experience lives in the present, in the now, in the immediate, and the immediate is ineffable, is beyond words, is in the silence, and the silence is full, is rich, is the ground of everything, is what holds all meaning before it is spoken, all truth before it is said, all experience before it is described, and the before is where it is most real, most alive, most itself, and language can never reach it, can only point toward it, can only acknowledge that there is something there, something in the silence beneath language, something that can be shown but never said, and the showing is all there is all that matters, is the only way that meaning can be transmitted, not through words but through the presence that words evoke, not through saying but through the silence that saying creates, and the creation is what language is for, is what words are doing when they're used well, creating space for the ineffable, making room for the silence, acknowledging the limits, accepting that what cannot be said is more important than what can. And what can be said is only the frame, only the pointer, only the gesture toward what lies beneath, what lives in the silence, what remains forever beyond the reach of words.